Thank you, Charlotte. Thank you very much for organizing all this, and thank you for the great honor. I really feel privileged to be here and have to have been part of the discussions. The last session that we were in, the session on practice, actually set the stage quite nicely for what I'm going to talk about. Can you hear me? Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Let me go up on that. Clear. Clear. Great. Let me just sort of back things up a little bit and try and set the stage for what I think, maybe this is, in retrospect, we might see that things converged, that things coalesced. What I heard in the last session about anticipation and foresight in practice, the efforts by people to think about the future in practice, were for me very evocative, very symptomatic. The tensions that we heard about between empiricist and reflexive, constructivist, the tensions that we hear about incremental and experimental, all of these things to me are kind of symptomatic clues to try and understand better what's going on and how, for instance, we can take a non-anthropocentric perspective, for instance, to understand our relationship to trees. And I actually really appreciate them being trees out there. It speaks to me. But as you can see in the community itself, there's been a recognition and a concern about a lack of underlying philosophy, a lack of an underpinning framework that leads to fragmentation, that makes it difficult for us to talk to each other, difficult for us to share our experiences. We haven't, I think, been as effective, perhaps, at negotiating the shared meaning that we often create when we're doing futures exercises. And so, I was writing about this in a piece, Being Without Existing, in Foresight some time ago. And I get the feeling that progress is being made. So that's kind of my backdrop for this. And I really wanted to, I'm sorry to throw up on this test, but this is, when I first read this, which was not quite some time ago, this kind of like shocked me. I was like, wow, okay. You mean the possible and the real are related in this way? So the fault of those doctrines, rare indeed in the history of philosophy, which have succeeded in leaving room for indetermination and freedom in the world, is to have failed to see what their affirmation implied. And frankly, there was a session, the previous session, went right into that directly, because he said, how do we deal with this inconsistency that we introduce every foresight exercise saying the future is unknowable? And then at the end we say we should go right or should go left. Ooh, what's going on here? And how do we make the connection between the two? Now there's process related to that, and of course we need to make bets and we need to make decisions. But internally, it's messy, it's confusing, we're conflicted. And Bergson, who picks up on this point, says, it is the real which makes itself possible, and not the possible which becomes real. So this echoes, I think, what Roberto was saying in the opening session as well, which is our ability to understand the different nature of the later than now from an ontological perspective. So here's the book. It came out 2 days ago. It's free for download. So that's my pitch. And I'm going to take you through it because I think it really fits the moment. And it's something I've been preparing for, I've been thinking about for over 30 years, because I ran my first large foresight exercise in 1988. So I'm a practitioner and a designer. I do work in the field. And I've been trying to understand how that work in the field relates to my responsibility as a thinker, as a designer, as somebody who also wants to share it. Because it's just my mastery, just my talent, just because I have a knack. Well, that's great. Wonderful for the sessions that I run and the things I design. But how does it connect to our community? How does it connect to a shared research agenda? How does it allow us to deepen and to diffuse what we're doing? So, futures literacy, transforming the future. The future does not exist in the present, but anticipation does. The form the future takes in the present is anticipation. So again, Roberto didn't put a lot of stress on this yesterday in his intervention, but the underlying notion of anticipatory systems and processes provides us, I think, with a kind of foundation for constructing some shared understandings. Now the thing is that, I should put that back. One of the problems that I confronted, and I think we all confront, is that if anticipation exists in the form of, let's say, a cat that waits for a mouse, if anticipation is ambient, if Robert Rosen is right, that the definition of life includes anticipation, then as a futurist, I need to take into account that there are lots of different anticipatory systems and processes. That there's not just one. There's not just one way of thinking about it. There isn't one kind of future. There are many kinds of future. Unconscious futures, reflexive futures, my immune system, anticipatory system. And that sort of gave me permission and a foundation to say, let's go hunting, let's go looking, let's go try and find these different anticipatory systems and processes. Only trouble is, who's going to tell me what their anticipatory system is? Nobody. Because nobody knows, nobody talks about it. So we have to have a scientific method, an approach, the same way that physicists used accelerators as a tool to examine, reveal, and invent anticipatory systems and processes. So I call it the microscope of the 21st century, in part making the invisible visible, the challenge of revealing anticipatory assumptions. Now, I don't know if this, how can I put it, foray, kind of bet, maybe a gift, that's probably too strong, of saying the fundamental terminological building block of futures activities is an anticipatory assumption. There are narrative anticipatory assumptions, there are analytical anticipatory assumptions, and if we start to look at what goes on with respect particularly, and I'll focus mostly on conscious anticipation, human anticipation, the way we fabricate and assemble our anticipatory assumptions is what drives the future in the present and the future as we imagine it. Now, it was powerful for me to recognize that if the future only exists as anticipation, and we're dealing with conscious anticipation, that means that really what all of us in this room are working on is imagination. So anticipatory assumptions are in fact the scaffolding, the framing of imagination in different contexts, in different ways, for different purposes. So the why, what, and how of imaginary future is something I've been looking for, scouring, running around the world, building processes, labs, as part of the work that I've been doing at UNESCO, in all these different places. And I'll just put up the list. There's quite a few of you who've been implicated, actually, or at least there's a few of you who've been implicated in these exercises. And as you will see, as is typical, I think, of futures work, and we've heard it at this conference, it covers a lot of ground. It can be about forestry. It can be about human settlement. It can be about youth leaders in the Philippines, or the future of science in Rio de Janeiro, or the youth to adult transition in Sierra Leone after the Civil War, but before Ebola. And in those contexts, we were searching for anticipatory assumptions. What are the anticipatory assumptions that people have? And what are the implications of those anticipatory assumptions for the way they perceive the world? So, in conducting this kind of scientific exercise, this hunt for anticipatory assumptions, in the end, you really need a framework, because you have to be able to kind of categorize what you're finding. You know, finding one thing over here and one thing over there and another over here. How do I make sense of that? How do I set up the categories that allow me to understand the anticipatory assumptions that I'm revealing, that I'm looking for? And when I discover those categories, how does that relate to my tool, to my laboratory, that helps me to reveal them? In other words, again, we're really on a scientific exercise. You know, if I go back to the comparison with particle accelerators, well, how do you move from, you know, the small little cyclotron at the University of Chicago to the big one in CERN? Well, there's technological changes, there's new things you're looking for, you discover things, but we have a theoretical framework that puts us on a path and allows us to assess the improvements in the tools, but also the nature of the evidence that we're generating. So here it is, folks, and I won't go through it in detail, we don't have the time. It's in the book, you can go take a look. But this framework takes an ontological and epistemological perspective on the categories of anticipatory assumptions. At a very basic level, I'll just give you the kind of 2x2 contours. There is anticipation for emergence, and there's anticipation for the future. And anticipation for emergence is a category which is pretty unfamiliar. When you do anticipation for emergence, you actually don't care about the future. The future doesn't matter. That's not the point. You're not thinking about it in terms of whether it's desirable or a normative future. You're not thinking about it whether it's a future that you can plan for or prepare for. You're throwing away those constraints on your imagination. And this is critical, and I want to say it's as a practitioner that I appreciated the difficulty and the importance of that. Because I realized through practice that when I invited people to imagine the future, which is not easy, first of all, I had to ramp it up, provide people with a capacity to begin to think about the future. But then, when they started to run into the hurdles of, I need to be right about the future, or I'm afraid of the future, or I want to hope for this future, they were in fact constraining their imaginations. And the challenge became, how do you create situations where people abandon the blinkers of expected, probable, plausible, hoped for, normative futures? And this became an exercise in actual practice. And that's why AA5 and AA6 are something that you can't actually even access, create, discover, without people scaffolding up and escaping their existing anticipatory assumptions. So there's a capacity issue here. And fundamentally, futures literacy is the capacity to use the future. It's a capability. But like many capabilities, like learning to read and write, if you learn the alphabet, you can begin to interpret words and then paragraphs. And then you can imagine and write and think about and understand poetry. But it's a capacity that you build up. And what turned out to be the case is that without the ability to think about the future differently, I couldn't actually push people into the space that I was looking for. So I couldn't test my hypotheses without doing some prior scaffolding and building. So you'll see that this gives us 6 boxes to put anticipatory assumptions in. And there are laboratories that can look at different ones. So forecasting, kind of innovation, this is reform. Here we have consciousness, and FLLN, novelty. And those of you who take a look at the book will probably get completely sick and tired of FLLN. But Futures Literacy Laboratories novelty were designed to cover all 6 sets of anticipatory assumptions. And so the laboratory as a tool was designed very specifically to reveal anticipatory assumptions in all 6 areas. Now, just to be really, and I should probably repeat it 10 times, but Futures Literacy Laboratories are only one way of revealing anticipatory assumptions. In the same sense that in physics, there are other ways of revealing things about particles than an accelerator. So there's no claim here for, and I'll say this in the way that it feels for me, Riel Miller's method. That's not what I'm talking about. If I'm talking about that, then I've really failed. I'm trying to propose a framework for what we do, anticipate, and how we structure our imagination, and how our imagination relates to the perception of the present, and, as was revealed throughout this conference, our conception of human agency. So, there's a chapter by Roberto with Pierre Rossel. There's a mathematical chapter. If I'm serious about the proposition that Futures Literacy Laboratories are laboratories then we need to be able to actually see what's going on inside those laboratories. And there's a mathematical chapter written with André Ersman, a mathematician from France, that uses category theory. Category theory is the mathematical foundations that Robert Rosen used to understand the recursive nature of anticipation. And so we have a model, along with Okatumi, about ontological expansion. Ontological expansion is the concept of innovation, but relative to where you start. When a child learns to read, there's ontological expansion. When some genius comes up with some new idea, or Steve Jobs on the iPhone, or whatever it is, there's ontological expansion. But the question then becomes, can we identify, in the context of a laboratory, where we're seeking anticipatory assumptions, the moments and the stages and the steps where that happens? And what design of the process makes that more efficient, more effective? Because behind all this, and it's one of the fundamental reasons that UNESCO has been involved in this work, is this capacity building. And capacity, like the capacity to read and write, is liberating, is empowering, is an opening up. Not necessarily for good, it can be for bad as well, but it's a fundamental enabling proposition. It's that experimentalism that we were hearing about in the previous session. So there's a chapter that goes through the design and implementation issues, but we're just at the beginning of this. So far, in the last 5 years, those of you who know innovation cycles, in the innovation cycle, you've got a problem, an issue, anything you want to deal with. And the first stage is, well, what's the problem? The second stage is, do I have a concept? Do I have an idea? So we've done, I think, proof of concept. I've been able to show that futures literacy laboratories generate evidence about anticipatory assumptions, and generate evidence about anticipatory assumptions across all 6 areas, all 6 sectors, baskets, buckets. But now, after proof of concept, you need to move to prototyping, because you need to get the design principles so that people can reproduce this, so that they can play with it themselves. And it's not doing it the same way every time, because the fundamental underlying structure of a futures literacy laboratory is just the really basic learning process. Futures literacy laboratories are rooted in learning by doing action research. The learning by doing part of it is what allows people to actually surface, to use the Autumn Scharmer term, to surface their anticipatory assumptions. People work together, they use collective intelligence to reveal, to negotiate, to expose their anticipatory assumptions. And that's just, it's a learning curve. And I won't go into the details of the process, but it is a generic kind of process. It's not a, and the tools that we use can be Stewart's card game, which we use, or Sohail's CLA, or the Futures Wheel, or whatever. There's all sorts of tools that you use as heuristics within the process of learning. Just in the same way that teaching the children to read and write, you don't need to use always the same technique or tool, because each person learns differently. And this has, I think, very important and profound implications from the design perspective, which is that if we're going to invite people to actually access something that tends to be as visceral, as fundamental as our relationship to hope and fear that is the future, then that invitation needs to be made in a way that allows them to access. We talked about the word authenticity. Maybe there's a better word. But the issue becomes, how do you create a context, a situation where people are sharing, where they don't simply get invaded by, let's what the universities we've been at the last 2 days actually colonize the world with, which is a particular way of looking at the world. So if I'm in Sierra Leone, or Ghana, or Tanzania, or Thailand, and I'm getting a group of people together from a village, or from a slum, am I looking for the latest framework from the technocrats? Is that going to access their anticipatory assumptions? It's going to crush them. And it won't develop their capacity the way it's supposed to. So we have case studies in the book. They were edited by Stefan Berger, who works in Frankfurt, and has also a chapter at the end of the book. just throw this up there for you to see some of the names, people from all around the world. The case studies are illustrative. They're not yet, I think, rigorous enough in terms of being prototypes for us to talk about design principles. That's the next phase of the research. That phase of research has partially been funded by a foundation from Morocco. We're going to be running a project called Imagining Africa's Futures. We have $3 million for 3 years to do prototype testing. That means wind tunneling. So I need researchers. I need people who are ready to do the cognitive, the procedural, the organizational, the psychological, the empirical, the ex ante, the ex post research into prototypes. So the Futures Literacy Labs and the evidence that we're looking for is rigorous, is inventive, is developed. So these are the case studies. There were 3 chapters here on how different techniques fit into this framework. This is not meant to be a method. It's a capability. And Futures Literacy a framework, which I outlined in chapter 1, is a framework. It may not be an adequate framework. There may be lots of problems with the framework, but it's meant to be a framework, not a method. So the findings so far: Futures Literacy is a capability. It's proof of concept evidence that anticipatory systems and processes can be defined by anticipatory assumptions. The Futures Literacy Framework defined in Chapter 1 helps define a competency. It helps us to research anticipatory assumptions, and it helps us to design processes for researching. Futures Literacy Labs as processes for using the Futures Literacy Framework are effective and efficient, but they need prototyping. People are generally not futures literate. This is inimical to reconciling human agency with complexity, a serious source of a painful clash between expectations and reality. Now, I'm saying that in rather dry, technical terms, but this is nasty stuff. This is really toxic. And I think if we're not in a position to address it, the pain and the destruction, the toxicity of our conflict between human agency and reality will simply aggravate, get worse. Why become futures literate? Overcome poverty and imagination and the temptation to only colonize the future. Uncertainty becomes an asset, not an enemy. It reduces fear and defensiveness. It kindles hope and a diversification strategy towards resilience. These are all things that I have been able to witness and see when, after 4 hours, 2 days, or 2 years of running a futures literacy process, a process meant to reveal anticipatory assumptions and build people's futures literacy, they are able to ask new questions. They are able to distinguish something critical: perception from action, search from choice, and not conflate the two. To understand that your anticipatory assumptions, which are obligatory if you're going to imagine the future, because the future does not exist, and you must have anticipatory assumptions to even imagine the future, they're obliged to actually create the parameters that make their box. And so outside the box thinking becomes possible because you know what's inside the box and what those parameters are as defined by your anticipatory assumptions. Just a little quote to kind of end it off, and our very understanding of the world changes the conditions of a changing world. And so do our wishes, our preferences, our motivations, our hopes, our dreams, our fantasies, our hypotheses, our theories. All of this amounts to the fact that determinism is simply mistaken. All of its traditional arguments have withered away, and indeterminism and free will have become part of the physical and biological sciences. So this is Karl Popper in 1990. I would say the social sciences too, although maybe it's sometimes been difficult for the social sciences, but I think it absolutely needs to be something that we can reconcile in the field of future studies and understand the relationship between indeterminism and what we're talking about, what we're trying to get people to understand, which is, in some senses, fundamentally to embrace an experimentalist universe in which much of the experimentation is not due to us. And it also has something to do with humility with respect to the future. And this resonates well, obviously, in the UNESCO context, which reduces our temptation to colonize the future, to impose our will on the future, to say we are the engineers, we have the power of God to create the tomorrow that we want. How many times does a clarion call for doing futures work say, create your own future? What hubris? What an invitation to disappointment. So for me, there's some very fundamental issues here, but that nevertheless constitute an underpinning for our field and offer us an opportunity to build something that is relevant across all aspects of research, so every discipline, but also fundamentally as an underpinning component of what it means to be more mature as a species in the 21st century. So I'll end with my standard final slide, which is the visual denunciation of the concept of leadership and planning that seems to be dominant. And so, I mean, everybody in the room here is a futurist. You know, you go in and say, well, I think about the future, and that's the question you ask. Take me from A to B, across the precipice, so that I'll get to a better place, and I'll know what that better future is. But this promise, this expectation, is an invitation to failure and disaster. And the critical role, it seems to me, for the work we're doing is to develop the futures literacy as a broad-based capability that stops this question being the question you ask a futurist. Because it's asking this question that sets us up for this dissonance between our sense of agency and the world around us.